You're listening to Consulting Logistics, presented by Aborn & Company. I'm your host, Kyle McNaught. Thanks for checking us out. As a shipper in the supply chain, you know that understanding how all the pieces fit together is vital to running an effective transportation operation. One of the largest players in that puzzle is the carriers. So the more knowledge you have about how the carriers and their goals and worries and kind of what they're trying to do, the better understanding you're going to have about how to utilize them. So today we're going to talk about one of the top issues keeping a trucker and a motor carrier up at night: insurance. Now, before I bring on my guest, I want to start with an interesting piece of analysis that I actually was sent by the guest from a report by the American Transportation Research Institute titled Critical Issues in the Trucking Industry 2019. Quote, since 2013, fleets participating in the ATRI's operational cost of trucking data collection have seen insurance premium costs per mile increase over 17%. This has been driven by a number of factors, including increasing costs associated with equipment repair, rising medical costs, higher jury awards and settlement costs, and a greater safety and legal exposure. So to talk about this whole issue of insurance, I'm going to have Lane Munson, VP of Commercial Risk and Benefits at Aon Transportation and Logistics Practice, join Consulting Logistics. And we're going to discuss the whole insurance marketplace for carriers and why some of the current trends should be concerning for shippers. Lane, how's it going?
It's going well, Kyle. Thank you for having me on. Really excited to get into this conversation.
Yeah, me too. I'm super excited. And as you heard me butcher that intro, but you're fascinating to talk to. You and I've talked a little bit before we did this interview. So let's start off with a very easy question. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do with Aon.
Yeah, sure. One, thanks for the high praise. I don't know how interesting I really am, but I guess I'll go back to the beginning, right? Before I got into insurance and a little bit about me, I served in the Marine Corps. After the Marine Corps, I worked on a farm for about a year, just cutting down timber and putting up fence posts. Ended up, my little sister called me and asked me to come home. So I obliged and came back and didn't really know what to do in general with life. You know, the Marine Corps doesn't really prepare you for civilian life all that well, especially if you join on an infantry contract and get a top secret clearance. It's just kind of, what do you do next? So ended up waiting tables for a little bit and got introduced to a property insurance broker. And I slowly made my way into trucking insurance in about 2012. My family owns a trucking insurance agency. And from there, I started out making cold calls and placing insurance, and slowly made my way from my family agency over to one of the top global insurance firms in the world over here at Aon, and been at Aon since January 28th, 2019, and focusing all on the transportation and logistics industry and making sure that they have the right coverages, they're getting served in risk management and risk financing and employee benefits.
So, I mean, the first question is how do you not immediately go into being a spy? I mean, you got top secret clearance, you're trained by the military, you should have gone there. Easy answer. I don't know why you struggled with being on a farm.
That's a good question. That's a good question. Being a spy, I wanted to settle down and have a family and do things like that. And I don't know that being a spy is really conducive to doing those things.
You were concerned about a John Wick happening to you. All of a sudden your puppy's gone and you're like, okay, I'm going to have to go around Atlanta being crazy.
That's right, man. I take my puppies seriously.
Awesome. So talk to me a little bit about the kind of the clients you work with, and it's sort of, let's start transitioning into kind of what insurance works. How does it work with a carrier? What's insurance kind of take me through this. Help me understand what a trucker has to do when it comes to insurance.
Sure. So in 1980, I think it was, the federal government passed a law that mandated the minimum liability limits that a motor carrier has to carry to do interstate commerce. And those limits range from $750,000 to $1 million to $5 million. And it depends on what kind of commodity that motor carrier is hauling. If they're hauling petroleum, gasoline, hazardous materials, they're going to be required to carry a $5 million limit. And that limit goes to protect the public. And this is the auto liability. So if there is an accident on the road and a third party is injured or property is damaged, that's what this insurance is for. And that's really kind of one of the biggest headaches for folks right now on my side of the table.
So why is that a headache? If it's been something that's been around since the 80s, wouldn't it be something that they kind of planned for, budget for, that type of stuff, or what's happening?
Yeah, it is something that is planned for. It's budgeted for. The clients that I'm working with are typically between 100 and 500 power units. So, when they're looking at their budget and they're looking at 2020 and they're trying to figure out what the best way to finance their risk is, the trouble comes in with these catastrophic claims. We touched on it. You and I did a little bit earlier. So throughout 2019, just year to date, there's been $843,600,000 in catastrophic verdicts in the trucking industry. So as you can imagine, the insurance companies are paying out a good bit of claims costs.
Wait, so how is that possible? Is there just a lot of accidents, or what's occurring that is happening this much at $843 million in claims costs is going out?
Yeah, there are a lot of variables at play, and depending on who you ask, you could get a different answer. In my opinion, there is the litigious nature of our society right now. There are a lot of attorneys that have their billboards. I'm sure you've seen them, and a lot of your listeners have seen them with the billboards all over the place saying, if you've been, if you passed a truck and accidentally swerved off the road, give us a call. You could be a millionaire. That's hyperbole, but the nature of the business, people look at trucks and they just see a big bad truck, and if there's an accident, there's a lot of attorneys that are ready to sue. So that's one of the reasons. And the juries that are involved, and understandably so, are compassionate towards the people that have been involved in accidents. It's never a good thing when a person is seriously injured or, God forbid, somebody dies in a truck accident. So yeah, there's just a lot of variables at play with these verdicts.
Yeah. And I mean, I've been reading up on this, kind of preparing myself, and there's been tons of articles, like kind of, especially about nuclear verdicts and stuff like that. I mean, do you have like a good example of where this is kind of how it's affecting trucking companies? Just kind of, I know the Warren lawsuit was an interesting one.
Werner,
that kind of happened recently. Yeah, Werner. And then there's also that Texas carrier. You want to help, like, tell me a little bit about these just examples, like to help kind of paint the picture a little bit more about what's really happening for like a trucking company.
Yeah. So with the Werner lawsuit, this is all out there on Freight Waves and these other places. You guys might even have an article on it too at this point. I'm not sure, but the judgment for Werner, that was like $90 million. The driver was driving and there was a snowstorm, and he controlled his vehicle. He stayed in his lane, and he was in training at the time, I believe. And what happened was a private passenger vehicle with a mom and I think her two children ended up crossing over the median, lost control because of the ice and snow on the road. And she struck the Werner truck. And of course, there were fatalities, and it was a terrible loss. And So the case went to court, and the attorneys, did discovery, and ultimately they said that there was negligence on the part of Werner for letting that truck driver be in that spot on the road at that time during the snowstorm. Even though he didn't cause the accident, their argument was basically that he should have never been there. And the jury agreed, and they awarded the family $90 million. And I think that's probably being appealed, but I don't know what's going on beyond that right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, but I think the interesting thing, I mean, it's a horrible, tragic situation regardless, but it's 90 million. And if I kind of think back to what you were saying earlier, the government's kind of only mandating 5 million.
Yeah.
So from what I understand about trucking and carriers, it's these carriers, they operate on kind of razor thin margins and really don't make a lot of revenue. So how does that work out? How does that kind of trickle down from the carrier when the family was awarded 90 million? Right.
Well, so Werner is one of the top trucking companies in the country. Most of my clients and clients of Aon, we bring options to them, right? We show folks what an excess liability policy. So just because the government says, hey, this is the minimum that you should do, this is the bare minimum, that doesn't protect a company's balance sheet or their executives or the public. And so the larger carriers that are getting options to insure themselves at higher limits, which is another reason that sometimes lawsuits can go up, because an attorney in discovery says, what kind of insurance limits do you have? And they find out that a motor carrier has a $5 million limit, and the attorney will say, great, we want $5 million. So that brings on a whole nother dynamic when it comes to these lawsuits. But motor carriers typically that are Werner size or, running more than 50 trucks are buying excess limits to protect themselves and their balance sheets.
But I mean, are they 90 million seems, and this is just my ignorance and kind of still learning and whatnot, but how does it, and like ignore Werner, I mean, just start with kind of the typical one who buys the 5 million. How do you handle this? What's trucking companies kind of doing when this type of lawsuit, which we're starting to see more and more? I mean, like you said, if you go to FreightWaves, like between you and I talking, I think back in September and us recording this in November, I have like 6 articles from FreightWaves, from Lodestar, from all these different things about like different juries rewarding massive amounts of money to victims. So how do you handle this? What are you as a truck? What are the carriers doing with this kind of verdict other than excess?
Frankly, they are, if they get hit with one of these, they're shutting down. They can't, most trucking companies can't handle a verdict. I mean, even, a $5 million verdict, a $10 million verdict, a guy running 30 or 40 trucks is not going to be able to handle that. And he's going to have to file for bankruptcy more than likely, or some other kind of protection. And, when that happens, obviously attorneys are going to be wanting money from somewhere. And we've seen it over here at Aon, and attorneys that I'm friends with or have working relationships with have shared jury verdicts and other verdicts with me that, you can see that the attorneys brought in the shipper, the freight broker, the trucking company, the driver, pretty much everybody and their brother that ever came within 100 yards of the freight is getting brought into these lawsuits. And a typical, the typical trucking company or an owner operator is carrying $1 million in limits. If there's a $5 million claim, that other $4 million is either going to get paid by the shipper, the freight broker, or that owner operator is going to file for bankruptcy. I mean, I've seen it time and time again.
Right. That's the fascinating point. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing. It's, and as you know, most of my audience is kind of shippers. That's sort of what I'm talking to. So I guess the question, or that kind of follow-up question, is like, what should a shipper then kind of be thinking about? Like, how do you work this? And I think a lot of what we talk about is being that, how do you make sure that you're working with the right carriers, the ones that kind of are preparing themselves in case a horrible thing like an accident could occur?
Yeah.
And I think one of the big things is the whole shipper of choice that I talked to. So how would kind of being a shipper of choice, or like really treating your motor carriers well, how would that help a shipper with a carrier kind of relationship?
Yeah. I think that, well, let me step back. The trucking industry is a very fractured industry, right? I think, if you put the top 5 or 10 motor carriers combined, take up like 5% of the market share. Right. So there are a lot of independent contractors and guys that run safely and they run their trucks in a way that is in line with federal regulations, and they're good drivers. At the same time, there's the bottom 10 to 15% of drivers that, maybe don't really care so much about the regulations, and they're not looking at what technologies are out there to make their trucks safer. And I don't think it's because they don't necessarily want to be safe. Part of the problem is the margins, right? They're making 3 to 5% margins, on $200,000 a year. There's just not a lot of money to go around and invest in yourself. So I think, go ahead. Sorry.
No. It's the fascinating thing. I mean, that's the whole point, right? Is that the especially truckload, it's not made up of these big players. I mean, they only own the stat always kind of changing, but it's something like the top 25 companies only own like 20% of the market share. So you are dealing with a huge pool of truckers, owner operators, that type of stuff. And it's interesting. Sorry, both of us keep distracting each other, but I mean, like you were saying, kind of continue with your point sort of that. Yeah. There's definitely best practices out there, but understanding kind of who you're working with is vital.
It is. And I think, with a smaller motor carrier, like 100 to 200 trucks, the ability for the shipper or to sit down with the guy that runs that company or the gal that runs that company is a little bit higher, than it would be for like a JB Hunt or a Swift. So I think it's wise just in general. And this is how I go about my just life is I enjoy getting to know people and what makes them tick. And I can generally tell if somebody is, if they have good character or if they might be lacking some integrity, right? And I think a lot of people have a sense for that. So I think sitting down with your motor carriers, asking them what safety initiatives they have, what do you see over the next 12 to 24 months? Are there any safety technology investments you're making? There's so much new technology out there. From lane departure to crash prevention, right? You got sensors that look forward and put the brakes on the truck and make sure you don't rear end somebody, which in Atlanta is highly important because absolutely nobody understands how to drive. And every day I see at least 7 to 10 people cut off an 18-wheeler pulling 80,000 pounds just because they were in a hurry to get home. And they had no idea that they almost never made it home.
It's not just Atlanta. I mean, I literally driving to work today, heard the semi slam on the horn because someone cut him off. And it was because that lane was moving slightly faster. I was like, why would you do that? That's a giant truck. But no, I get what you're saying.
Oh,
Sorry.
Dude, I was in an Uber yesterday. I mentioned to you before we started the call, I just got back from Dallas from our Transportation and Logistics Symposium. I got back Tuesday night. I flew down to Alabama, had a meeting with a client, flew back Wednesday afternoon, and my Uber, back home, the guy changed lanes about 100 times just to hop in the faster lane. And then he realized that the lane that he hopped into was actually slowing down. So, I mean, you see those guys. I'm more of a stay in my one lane until I get to where I'm going and just don't really worry about it from a safety perspective. I think it's because I've been doing trucking insurance. But I want to get back to the point with shippers and motor carriers.
That just real quick sidebar. That is actually one of the funniest things because I've experienced the same thing. I'm like, wow, I actually start you think about semis a lot more just once you get into the industry.
Yeah.
But yeah, back to that.
Well, pro tip. Okay. If you're driving on the highways, folks, and you find yourself next to the front axle of a trailer on an 18-wheeler on the passenger side, get away from it. They cannot see you. If you're near the end of the tractor or the front of the trailer, you're in a bad spot. I won't say that.
This is all just spy advice.
Yeah. They can't see you, which brings me back to technology. Okay. There are, I think it's called Mirror Eye. Kind of new. I think some folks are using it. Maverick Transportation, I believe, has some. There's new technology now that puts a mirror, a camera, kind of a video stream on the mirror, and it shows the driver what's in that blind spot. Right. So they can see before they ever change lanes, if that motorcycle driver, or if that guy riding that bike is over there. Or if that little Honda Civic with the spoiler on it and the loud what do you call it, muffler? The truck driver will be able to see that. Is that what you drive, Kyle?
No, I drive a truck.
Spoiler. All right,
I'm a Southerner. You know that.
We can keep talking. Okay. But there's and then that is one thing I think. And I don't know if shippers are having those conversations. I'm on the other side. I'm dealing with truckers all the time, and CFOs, safety directors. The safety technology today is leaps and bounds ahead of where it was even 2 or 3 years ago, and it's going to keep growing.
Right. But that's also the reason I wanted you on the show is because of that idea that you are having those conversations with the owner operators and those guys. And I think it's not fascinating. I hate saying that word. I don't know why I always say it. It's an extremely important note of what you said. Ask about safety and kind of understand the value you can have as a shipper of choice. So providing, if you're going to ask a trucking company, hey, what's your safety things? And I'm holding you to this standard. You also need to recognize that they're going to try to hold you to a standard, that they're going to, you need to be worth it for them. It's sort of that interesting thing that I think a lot of shippers kind of, you point the finger, you never kind of point the thumb a lot of times. I kind of hear that's sort of what I think is important. And where, I mean, you hear from these guys all the time. I mean, do they bring this up to you when you kind of talk to them about working with different transportation operations and stuff like that?
Like with different shippers?
Yeah, with the different shippers, how important
the motor carrier.
Yeah, the motor carriers.
I hear, I hear stories about certain shippers that like to, maybe they don't like to. Sometimes there's just no controls over who's sitting in the office that day. But a lot of drivers feel disrespected, right? They get told they can't use the bathroom. They're waiting to get loaded and basically have to sit around for 3 hours. And
when you kind of do that as a shipper, you're kind of limiting your pool that you can pick from. You have to almost start picking riskier carriers who, in theory, are probably kind of newer and in theory kind of chasing the dollar, trying to get that margin that they kind of are desperately seeking. And that's sort of one of those huge struggles, right? Is when you're looking at riskier carriers, you can be putting yourself in a very precocious, you like that word? Area.
I don't even know what it means, but yeah.
Me neither. I'm going to actually Google search it. I'm on Urban Dictionary, and this does not seem good for the podcast.
Okay, we're in trouble.
We're going to cut. But no, I mean, kind of the whole point of what we've been talking about is that, I mean, it's the number 9 worry for motor carriers is insurance. And it's because of a ton of factors. But one of the big ones is just the settlements coming out are nuclear, to kind of take a FreightWaves word. But there are nuclear verdicts coming out. So that idea of you're picking riskier carriers, it's can trickle down. It can go down the food chain, which is kind of the big point we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, and that's where the jury verdicts and these lawyers come in. Is if a shipper picks a carrier if that is less safe, and the federal government aggregates tons of data on motor carriers, so it's out there and it's available. If a shipper picks a motor carrier that is unsafe, and that unsafe motor carrier causes an accident that leads to one of these nuclear verdicts, then that lawyer has a lot of ammunition to play with to drag that shipper into the litigation and claim their negligence in choosing their motor carrier. And it can be avoided. It might cost a little bit more to use a well-respected and forward-thinking motor carrier that's investing in technology and investing in their people and their equipment. But ultimately, there's an opportunity to build a strong relationship between the motor carrier and the shipper, to have those negotiations about price and have the peace of mind that you're working with someone that respects the road, respects their equipment, and has a keen sense for safety. And that benefits everybody, from me and you to the shippers and everybody listening to this podcast.
Absolutely, dude. That's perfect. I wish I could have said it any better than myself. And I think most of my audience will kind of ideally put those pieces of the puzzle together. Technology isn't just about having a more automated approach or getting better data. It's also, at the end of the day, it's safety and just making sure all that stuff's there. So I think we can wrap up this interview. Tell people how they can kind of get in touch with you, especially, you friended me on LinkedIn. I think they're not friended, but connected with me on LinkedIn. I don't know why I can't say connected. Every time I think of LinkedIn, I always say friended. But yeah, we connected over LinkedIn. How can someone kind of get in touch with you, especially if they want to learn a little bit more and kind of hear your experience and stuff like that?
Yeah, LinkedIn is probably one of my favorite tools. I post as much content as I can that's relevant. Sometimes I leave some witty comments and pick arguments with interesting people. But you could find me, Lane Munson. I work for Aon, so that should help you with your search. Or, if you just simply want to send me an email or tell me how wrong I am about something, you can do that too. It's lane.munson@aon.com. If you can't spell it, find me on LinkedIn.
I'll put, what I'll do? I don't know why you're trying to poke the bear so hard. I'll include it in the show notes. So
you can do that.
The listeners of this, you can, if you're on your phone listening to it, go to the details. I'll throw in the link to your LinkedIn page there, Lane, so people can see all that type of stuff. But there's a ton more we could be talking about. Especially just that report you sent me, like we were talking about before. There's a fascinating little kind of the main concerns commercial drivers and motor carriers have. And one of them, it's that whole driver compensation, driver shortage thing. So there's a ton we can still be talking about. So I want the audience, I want the listeners kind of reaching out, letting us know what they think and talking to us. This is going to be a fun, hopefully we can do a couple more of these and kind of keep talking, because it was a blast talking to you, dude.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love to. Yeah, you too, Kyle. Thank you.
All right, man. Thanks for joining me. Are you asking what type of safety precautions your carriers have in place? Or is there even more you'd like to hear from Lane? Let me know. I'm Kyle at kyleandaborn.com. That's the email. So Kyle at abornandco.com, not Kyle and Aborn. It'd be a fun name. Kyle at abornandco.com is the email. Or connect with me on LinkedIn. Actually, Lane and I kind of started off our whole kind of conversation connecting on LinkedIn. So Lane was a blast to talk to and has a ton of great insights into carriers' perspective. So I'd love to have him on again. Just let me know. What do you want us to talk about? Kind of comment, let me know. That'd be super fun. What to actually plug now? Well, we didn't actually film this interview because Lane's based in Atlanta. And as much as I like to travel to the ATL, This show doesn't have any sponsors, so I couldn't really find a way to justify a 30-minute interview to my bosses. Now, listen, this is kind of your fault. You as a listener need to go check out the video podcast and blow up the numbers. Actually, it's funny, Lane watched one of the more recent ones and he was making fun of me before the interview because of the video. So yeah, I mean, I try to have fun with the video stuff. I try to make it a little more unique than just this podcast. So yeah, to go see our past interviews and past videos, go to the Aborn YouTube channel. I actually will post a video version of this podcast, but it's just going to be audio. And like, I don't know, let me know. I think it's easier. Like, I think if you don't kind of listen to this as a podcast, listening to kind of a YouTube video is an easier way. But if there's a better location that I should be uploading these kind of video versions of this to, let me know. Especially if it's easier to share something. I just feel like sharing a YouTube link's a lot easier than sharing a podcast link. Trust me, I try to send this to my family and they have no idea how the heck to even listen to these things. So if you got a better location, let me know. And while you're on our YouTube channel or on that whole like page, check out some of our other videos. We've got some pretty cool stuff, including past episodes of Consulting Logistics, some really cool case studies that we did. And we also have some pretty cool short informational stuff about kind of what's it like going digital in transportation. So tons of cool things. Just search Aborn and Company on YouTube and we should pop up. And if you're viewing this on your phone, I'm also going to include a link in the show notes. So just kind of hit the details page. There should be something that will kind of pop it right up for you. So for Lane Munson, I'm Kyle McNaught. Peace.